Hey team, I've had a couple of folks ask me questions about what's going on in the kind of the global financial crisis category, and I figured I'd just put it on video to save everybody time. So I'm not going to talk at all in detail about Silicon Valley Bank or Credit Suisse First Boston or bonds or any of the kind of the tactical stuff. What I want to really focus on is the key question of what's the likelihood of a very significant event, specifically the meltdown of the dollar. All right, so that's the point of this video. If you think the likelihood of that is zero, then you can just hit stop and move on. My premise is the likelihood of that is greater than zero, though not enormously greater than zero, but let's walk through the logic. I think there's 5 key characteristics to be thinking about. And the model that I want to put is, in some sense, very simple. Just imagine a graph that has a blue line and a red line, and the x-axis is years. And it's 0 to 100. And the blue line represents the perception of the dollar as safe. So if the number is 85, the perception is the dollar is very, very safe. And if the perception is 4, the perception is the dollar is not very safe, more or less. And the red line represents the perception that there is a reasonable alternative to the dollar, right? So the key point here is that as long as the dollar is the only real game in town, then even if the perception of the stability of the dollar is relatively low, people are still going to end up going in the dollar. And as we all know, what's been going on over at least the past 15 years, is that it's oftentimes the case of the least bad alternative, right? So for example, in 2008, as the American financial system was freezing up, and there was a meaningful risk that on Monday morning ATM machines wouldn't work anymore, confidence in the dollar plummeted. Let's say it went from 80 to 35, something like that. However, at the time, 2 things were true. One was the best reasonable alternative was maybe, I don't know, the Swiss franc or the euro or gold, something like that. And none of those were anywhere near 30. And in particular, as the financial crisis clearly spread outside the US, many of those alternatives started to plummet on their own. And so, the only non-correlate asset out there was gold or barter, and that's a very low number, call it 2. So even though the dollar maybe was low, it was less weak than everything else, and much, much better than any non-fiat currency alternative. And so everybody had to pile into the dollar, which then made it pop back up, right? So we've kind of seen this up and down cycle a few times over the past 15 or so years. All right, key message. Now, assumption number 1, or premise number 1, is that the financial system that froze up in 2008 never really actually got healthy. Instead, what happened is clear breaks were patched. Liquidity was pumped in like crazy, so the system continued to move. But that fragility has just cycled through all over the place, right? It's cycled all over the world. If you take a look at the Chinese debt ratio before 2008 and now, like, it's gone skyrocketed because China absorbed a lot of that fragility in their own economy. It's also cycled out of the financial system into other modes, like lack of confidence in the government in general. Right? So confidence in institutions has also plummeted. So we've held a minimum viable confidence in the dollar, in the financial system, but while pushing fragility all over the place. And I don't think this is enormously controversial. I think that, for example, Ray Dalio, quite famously, and he's not even vaguely alone, have largely called the play. That it's not a matter of if, but when the kind of the dollar as we understand it goes through some kind of massive transition, devaluation or reset, something like that. And the when may not be that long. Maybe not tomorrow, but maybe in a year, 5 years, 10 years, something like that, okay? So metaphorically, we can think of this as sort of a pressure that is pushing that blue line down as the clock is ticking on our ability to continue to maintain colorable stability of the basis of the global dollar. All right. I'll do 2, 3, and 4. All right, so 2. In 2008, the only real alternative at the end of the day was gold, and that's not much of an alternative. In the meantime, China has made real serious headway in presenting the yuan as a alternative, particularly most recently, right? So with Russia and China allying, with people like Iran and Saudi Arabia looking like they're right on the horizon, Brazil, Oman, Nigeria, like there's a lineup. And if I think about the complex of those entities, I have the ability to imagine being able to get access to most manufactured goods, most energy, and a lot of food indexed in yuan. So as an alternative to the dollar, it's starting to become colorable. I don't know what the number is, but maybe it's not 2. Maybe it's 15, 20, particularly if I'm a member of the relatively large number of nations in the world that have not enjoyed being yanked around by the politicization of the dollar, which has been endemic for a long time, and are interested in at least having an alternative, right? So if I've been very much holding everything in dollars forever, maybe I'll put 15, 20, 30% in the yuan just to have a backup. And so the next time Uncle Sam comes and tries to yank me around, I can say, hey, I've got an alternative, right? So it's a strategic diversification. That's meaningful, right? Because now the blue line doesn't have to drop to 2, it only has to drop to like 20, and suddenly there might be a real shift. Then we have this thing that Balaji is calling out, which is say also in 2008, there was no digital decentralized alternative. And now there is. You can go back and forth on the degree to which you believe that there is a reality to, say, Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. But a year and a half ago, there was about $2 to $3 trillion worth of total value stored up in that category, which ain't nothing. And the biggest advantage this particular category has is that it is not meaningfully subject to nation-state political decline. You get what you pay for. You know what you're getting yourself into, which has got a lot of advantages. And while the quote-unquote rails for getting into Bitcoin are in fact getting narrower, I assure you that for the majority of actual wealth held in the world, family offices, sovereign wealth funds, multinationals, etc., they are not going to have any trouble getting into crypto if they so choose. And this particular one has an interesting force feedback dynamic, because while a move of a reallocation of resources from dollars to yuan will show up as a real exchange rate difference, because of the incredible inelasticity of crypto and its relatively small size, the difference will be much more pronounced, right? So right now, for example, 500 billion, maybe a little bit more, $700 billion are currently held in Bitcoin. Well, it's not that hard to reallocate twice that. Like, not hard at all. So, and we've seen it before already, like it's already been 3 times that much in the not too distant past. So what happens, of course, is that if that occurs, the price of Bitcoin to dollars doubles. And so that's notable. That causes a different psychological impact, which we've seen in the past, right? The FOMO rush. Now, in and of itself, that has its own dynamic of cycling up and down, and whatever. People can have their own opinions on that. But the point is, if I see that blue line going down, if some kind of event occurs, like let's say things continue to get worse in the banking system globally, and the blue line starts to move, 40, 50, 48, 45, 42, 38, something like that. And there's also, by the way, a move into the digital yuan that's not trivial, right? So you start seeing exchange rates move there. It becomes rational for many resource allocators to say, well, I'll put 0.5% of my assets in this other basket, Bitcoin, just to hedge, maybe 1%. Well, if even a small number of wealth managers make that decision, that actually ends up being a meaningful amount of money, which causes that number to go up, which causes a larger number of people to have different calculus of what they want to do. And so you can get this accelerating feedback loop that would cause money to say, maybe I do need to move. And of course, the problem is, remember that fire? It's not a matter of if, but when. And if the consciousness says, oh shit, maybe when is now, you can get a race to the exits. And therein lies the biggest risk, right? The notion that the dollar will forever, for all time, be the certain, most secure thing, it ain't a thing, right? Eventually, it's going to go away. And the question is when. And now, when do people begin to think, oh, maybe now? And that's sort of the big picture story. Now, the last piece I want to put on there is this whole CBDC thing. central bank digital currency. And I would just say this is coming. It's coming for more or less three reasons. One is the Chinese are ahead of the game. Right? The digital yuan is a real thing, and it's powerful. It's a very useful thing to be able to have a digital currency that can flow like the digital economy is looking for and is used to. And the dollar is, at the end of the day, a big ass kludge. Right? We moved off of gold, we moved to the petrodollar. We've been yanking together different ways of doing different payment mechanisms, but it ain't a pure play in the digital realm. Right? So one is to compete with the digital yuan, and I can tell you for sure, first-person experience, that's on the board of the guys in Washington who make decisions. Two, well, there's a lot of power that happens when you have a central bank digital currency. There's a lot of things you can do as a central banker and as a government that you can't do with the existing dollar regime. Many of them are things that maybe people like myself aren't really excited to have happen, but there are very few technocrats who would pass up having that toolkit at their disposal. So it's, we got to compete with the Chinese, and boy, I sure would like to have this. It's going to want to happen. And then the third, that fire that's burning, right? It's the guys who are sitting at the Fed, sitting at the Treasury, are very aware of the fact that the clock is ticking, the wick has been lit, the candle is melting. One of the best ways to get out of that is some kind of shift from the Bretton Woods 43,000.7 kludge that we've been operating under to a big reset to a central bank digital currency. You can flush a lot of bad stuff out of the system when you do that. So that's almost like the blue line going flatline, meaning the folks behind the blue line decide, you know what, we're out of this business too. We're going to give you a trade. We're forcing everybody to flop from the dollar to the new digital dollar, which is going to be super cool and awesome, but that's all there is to it. And so if you have a belief that you're going to be able to just sort of sit in dollars forever, the answer I would propose is no, that ain't going to happen. There's going to be a shift to the CBDC in your not too distant future. All right, so I've got a fire behind me that's kind of pushing things forward and causing that blue line to sort of edge its way down. I got this red line moving up through the BRICS motion. I've got the red line moving up through the crypto motion. I've got possible force feedback loops, and then I've got a potential event horizon of CBDC in front of me. Well, that's where we are. Does this particular kind of global banking insolvency crisis push the system over the top? Don't know. I don't think so. Feels like it's not that big. Feels like it's big, but it's not that big. It's not as big as COVID. Of course, COVID already happened, and we haven't necessarily metabolized the consequences of it. And it could get bigger. So keep your eye on it. My gut says, somewhere between 2 and 8% that now's the time, which is kind of fucking big given the implications. Now, of course, that's a complete hand-wavery thing. I don't have any real deep math behind that by any stretch of the imagination. But it's definitely worth paying attention to. I'd say that for sure.